But I'm going to run through a quick update on kind of where the Ceph community is at and a little bit about some of the dev milestones that are going on right now and kind of where we're headed next. So should be nice and short and sweet. Try not to put you to sleep after lunch here. So we'll talk a little bit about the community. I've got some stuff about current dev operations around Giant, some of the modules, orchestration and deployment, as well as some of the discussions that we're having right now around our release cadence. And then I can answer any questions you may have about Ceph in general or the community, and I'll do my best not to flub them. So the community. So the question I get asked most often these days is kind of, what is life like in the post-acquisition world now that Ceph and Inktank folks are living life under the red hat? I have to say it's been pretty good. The nicest thing about Red Hat is they've really been, obviously doing open source for a long time, and so they kind of have an ecosystem of people who get it. So the very first thing that happened once we got into Red Hat was everyone inside Red Hat was told to leave us alone. I said, these guys are doing great things, just let them keep doing those things. We'll figure out the rest later. For those of you that didn't follow the acquisition closely, it was probably the fastest one I've ever seen, and I haven't seen a whole lot of them, but I do know that in a room filled with 10 bankers and lawyers and everyone, when this thing finally got signed, they all kind of looked around the room astonished and said, I've never seen an acquisition close this fast. So it was kind of fast and furious there for a little bit. But thankfully, they've kind of just left us to our own devices, with the exception of obviously giving us some additional resources. And now that some time has passed and everyone has kind of become acclimated, we are starting to get kind of folded into Red Hat a little bit more. And with that being folded in a little bit more comes obviously a little bit more focus on the Red Hat distributions. As most of you know, Ceph started its days as primarily an Ubuntu shop. All of the developers developed on Ubuntu. They spent all of their time testing against Ubuntu, and then all of the other packages after that were kind of an afterthought. Obviously that has grown even before the acquisition, and now that we're here, we're doing a very concerted effort to make sure that all of the distributions get their due attentions. And with that, there's obviously a fair amount of time that's being spent looking at the kind of the stack of Red Hat distributions. And I don't know if you guys have been following the whole CentOS thing as well, but with that, they're kind of looking at Fedora as the fast-moving errant little brother. For those of you that use Fedora will probably get angry at me for calling it that. But CentOS is the one that's more stable in the middle, but maybe you can run a newer kernel. And obviously RHEL is kind of the slower moving enterprise thing that doesn't change quite as fast, so that you can depend on it to do what it needs to do. And there's actually a fair amount of movement right in the middle. We've got a number of community members now that are starting to push for kind of CentOS as the way to go with Ceph now that we're under Red Hat. That said, we are still maintaining all of our Ubuntu and SUSE coverage. We are making sure that because we got acquired by Red Hat, we're making extra sure that I think it was about 80% of our users were on Ubuntu before the acquisition. So we want to make sure that those folks don't feel like they're left out in the cold. So if you are using Ceph on Ubuntu, feel free to continue doing so, because there are a large number of us that want to see that continue to be a viable option. And the other question, which I actually got asked at lunch today, which is, how are we coexisting with Gluster? The answer is we don't know. The good part of the answer, however, is neither does anyone else, and everybody's willing to figure it out. It's kind of up in the air right now. Given the state of CephFS, we are kind of very easily drawing the line down the middle of the road and saying, Gluster has a file system. That's where that goes right now within the Red Hat ecosystem. And Ceph has the object and block stuff that's been maturing very quickly under the umbrella of OpenStack. So that's kind of the easy division right now. Now, That said, a lot of effort is still going into CephFS right now, and when CephFS becomes mature, that's going to take that whole messaging and throw it right out the window. So we're still kind of figuring out how it's going to land, but the short answer is Red Hat really is doubling down on both of them to make sure that neither community feels like they're getting squashed under the other one. So yeah, it should be an interesting future either way. And obviously, with all of this, you know, we're learning things in both directions. Red Hat is learning some things from us, and we're definitely learning some things from them, especially how to scale people to large numbers. You know, given that Inktank was only about 55 before the acquisition, and now we have, you know, 6,500 new coworkers. So it's been kind of interesting. All right, the next big thing in the community is SEF Days. Well, obviously you guys heard about it because you made it here. But we're really turning up the heat on the SEF Day program. We're trying to get these to a lot more locales now that we have kind of the time, manpower, and resources to do so. The SEF Day events have been really great for us in the past because it allowed, you know, people like us to kind of get together and discuss what's next? What do we need out of Ceph? What's it doing? What's it not doing? And then we could take that feedback directly back to our developers and hand it to them. And it's been a really good driving force behind kind of our roadmap decisions. I tell you, it was the Ceph Days probably more than anything else that pushed us into saying, okay, we're a startup, we need to focus. What do we focus on? And we focused on OpenStack. It turns out that was the right answer. But now, like I said, we're taking the focus of SEF Days and we're shifting them a little bit. We're cutting out all of the marketing, sales portion of it, and we're trying to make these really naturally community events. You will probably see much more developer-focused activities at these things in the future. And I can tell you for sure that no two SEF Days are going to be alike. So if you have the opportunities to attend multiples, I would highly encourage you to do so. Every single one of the SEF Days is pulling speakers out of the community, just like you've seen today already. Now, a lot of our community members that were recruited to speak here today are becoming less community and more just members as Red Hat goes on a crazy acquisition spree. But in the future, you'll definitely see, like San Jose, we've got people from, you know, Brocade, and we've had people from Citrix, and, you know, there's all kinds of people out there that are developing with Ceph either in enterprise environments as a user or are just interested hobbyists. And those are the types of people you'll see showing up at these events. So definitely spread the word. We've got one coming up in San Jose a week from today. We have ones coming up in New York City and London. And by all means, if you have a location where you would like to host a SEF Day, you have a venue, you know, thanks to Loic for finding this venue. This is a very unique venue. But it's always fun to go kind of new places and see where we can kick Ceph around. So yeah, definitely keep an eye on the SEF Day program going forward. The next thing that's kind of been big in the community world, or at least my world for the last few weeks, is the metrics stuff. We're really starting to look at expanding the footprint of our metrics.ceph.com. For those of you that didn't know it existed, we have a website that tracks many of our community metrics, from, you know, IRC to the mailing lists to code commits and tracker activity. We're doing a lot of stuff that we want to know. We want to know what the health is of our community, and in true Ceph fashion, we don't want to make any of this closed. So all of these materials and information that we're gathering about our community, we're immediately sharing back with our community. So we want to make sure that that's kind of accessible to everyone that's out there. And a lot of this really is community driven. So if there's something that you find interesting or a stat you think is missing, let us know. We put together a statement of work for the Bitergia guys, who are the ones that are building this. For those of you who don't know, Bitergia is a really small little company that kind of went nuts with a metrics dashboard, and they're doing a metrics as a service. They're the ones who built the OpenStack metrics. So all of this stuff is run by the Bitergia guys, and they took a number of open source projects, the metrics grimoire, CVS Annaly, and a few others, and kind of put it all together into this really cool, tight little metrics package. And they'll customize it any which way you want, because then they can take that customization and turn it around and use it for all of the other people that are using them for metrics. So it's actually a really cool little project, and we've seen some awesome stuff come out of it that's helped make some good decisions. So if you're interested, check it out. If you have any feedback, we're always happy to get it. The latest thing that we added there was the all history button over there. You see, you can now break it down by quarters. So we can actually go back in history and kind of look at snapshots of what was happening and when. The user committee, we actually just had a meeting, about a week ago, week and a half ago, something like that, pretty recently. The user committee was kind of our first baby steps towards moving our governance out of Inktank and into the community. Obviously, we want to do a lot more of that, and more of that is still coming. How that's going to manifest, I still don't know yet. That's one of those big question marks from the acquisition that hasn't been answered yet. But the user committee has actually been doing some really good stuff. Before SEF Days was moved more into a community effort, the user committee spent a lot of time organizing meetups and Loic launched. Would you launch this with Firefly as a part of the work up towards Firefly? I think it was. Yeah, right before Firefly. So the user committee launched with the focus of kind of promoting the community and giving them more of a solidified voice as it comes to things like Ceph development, but also the social parts that go along with that, the meetups, as well as some of the interactions in terms of just governing the project and the community itself, giving it a little bit more form and function. The reins have been handed over to Eric. Is Eric here? I saw his name on the list.
Well, there is a flight problem. So
oh, he got caught by our friends at Air France. Okay. Yeah, so he's the new chair of the user committee. Had a few other people step up with roles in there. There's still more roles to fill. Ideally, my hope for the user committee is that eventually they'll start taking over things like Ceph.com, managing the Ceph blog, and really kind of taking over this piece of the pie of the community operations. Obviously, I will continue to participate in that, but I would like to see a lot more of a separation of church and state between community and upstream versus product and Red Hat. And I'm going to do a lot of things in the near future to kind of delineate that and make sure that our community has the ability to kind of draw lines in the sand and say, no, this is what we're doing. And the user committee is obviously a great first start to do that. This meeting that just took place within the last couple of weeks addressed a few things. And another thing that those of you that hang out on the mailing lists a lot may have noticed, after every major release, you see a list of people of here are contributors by commits, and it kind of breaks out all of that interesting stuff out. That is a function of the user committee. There's a rotating schedule now of folks that put together that kind of snapshot of what went into each major release. So that's just one of the things that kind of is a part of the day-to-day operations, or release-to-release operations anyway. The contributor credits. And one of the big discussions that came out of this most recent one was our release cadence. There's been some rumblings that people feel like the Ceph release cadence is too fast to keep up with. And I feel like that's more a failure in communication on our part than anything else, as I mentioned. Now, as you know, we release quarterly. Every quarter there's a new release. And the feeling has always been that of these releases, every other one of them is what goes into kind of the productized, polished, the Inktank Ceph Enterprise is what it used to be called. I don't know what it's going to be called now. But every other one of those was the really kind of honed, polished, this is your production. And the ones that are opposite, the in-between releases, were feature releases that were designed to kind of get out there, not quite dev because they were polished and released, but obviously we aren't expecting enterprise production deployments to be upgrading their Ceph cluster every 3 months. That would be pretty ridiculous. So I feel like our communication needs to get better, but obviously we can continue to kind of feel that out and see where the release cadence will fall. Maybe we'll slow it down a little bit. But for now, we feel like every 6 months is pretty reasonable in terms of feature releases, especially because there are so many new features that are coming so quickly. You know, the erasure coding and tiering stuff, having Ceph that's now finally starting to show up on our horizon. These are all things that are very important to us to get out there because it means huge chunks of adoption for Ceph and growth and the ability for it to kind of continue to blossom very, very quickly. So obviously the meetups continue to grow. I think we're up to about 30 meetups now. Some of them more active than others. But the meetups obviously are a function of the user committee, but anyone can start a meetup. It can be 2 guys in a pub. It can be 30 guys in a conference room. It doesn't really matter. But we do have infrastructure in place via the user committee to provide you with things like swag and logistics, and there's help that you can get to start your meetup, publicize it, et cetera, if you have a bunch of folks that want to get together and talk Ceph. And then, yeah, then the rest of that meeting was discussing specific use cases and then discussing some of the upcoming work that was coming in the next release of Ceph. So the user committee, it's pretty lightweight, but we would like to see it kind of start to grow and be formalized a little bit more. If you're interested in participating, I definitely encourage you to do so. There's all kinds of places where folks can pick up and help with that. But like I said, it is our first step towards broader governance, and that is coming. Whether it's an independent third party or it's just bylaws and you know, copyright stuff that we write up as Red Hat as a single vendor is yet to be decided, but it's coming. Google Summer of Code. This actually just wrapped up for us. This was our first year participating in Google Summer of Code. Does anybody not know what Google Summer of Code is? All right, I figured most people would. Cool. It's in its, what, 10th year now? Is that what they're? Yes, 10th year of Google Summer of Code. This was Ceph's first year participating. We applied last year, didn't get accepted. I guess they just didn't feel like we'd gained enough momentum yet. But we had 2 students that signed up for Ceph projects out of, or 2 students that we were able to accept out of 12 applications that we had for people to work on Ceph. So there was a lot of interest relative to our size and available slots. But we had 2 pretty cool little projects that worked out with that. The stuff that Loic was talking about earlier, the reliability modeling, we had a student, a young lady in Switzerland, that was working on some of that stuff and extending that. Very academic. It was cool to see her end right up. I encourage you, it's on the Ceph wiki under the development section. If you go look there, you should be able to find it. Just the reliability final report or something like that. If you want it, I can find you the URL afterwards. But she did some really cool work there. Very, very academic. The other one was the Wireshark. We actually had a very, very small prototype of a Wireshark plugin for Ceph, for a Ceph dissector. Like 2.5 years ago it was written, and it just never worked. It wouldn't compile with modern Wireshark, and so we had a guy come in this summer. He wrote a brand new one, and it actually works pretty well. If you look at it, you can turn on the dissector, plug it into your Ceph cluster, and watch it go. It's pretty slick. He did a pretty good job with that. We will be applying again next year, so if you are hip deep in Ceph code all the time and you want to be a mentor, definitely send me a note. Let me know. It's always nice when we can get, because we had, I don't know, I think 25 or 30 suggestions of projects that people could write up and apply for. But it's always nice when, of those projects, they can all be different mentors, so people can kind of not only pick what they want to work on, but who they want to work on it with. So. CentOS, as I mentioned, there's been a lot of kind of excitement and effort going into Ceph on CentOS. And one of these efforts that we started just before the acquisition was getting more involved with them on a more formal basis. And if any of you follow the CentOS world, they've started these SIGs, the special interest groups. And it's basically creating a, I don't know if I would hesitate to call it a version of CentOS, but a collection of packages around CentOS that allow you to do a very specific thing. There's a cloud SIG and a vert SIG and a storage SIG. So what we're trying to do with the storage SIG, and it's still very much in its infancy, but we're trying to make it so that it's very easy for you to take a CentOS machine and turn it into a storage node of whatever type. We've already got packages put together for both Ceph and Gluster, and we've started to talk to like the ExtremeFS guys and the who was the other one? I don't know, but there were another couple of distributed storage type applications that want to start participating in this stuff. So, you know, if you know any of those guys, or if you are one of those guys, let me know. The more the merrier, because I think right now all of the people that are driving this thing are now internal to Red Hat. So it'd be good to get some, not have such an echo chamber. So, yeah. Governance, yeah, as I mentioned, with the user committee stuff being kind of the first step towards governance. Those of you that have heard my discussions or talks previously about governance, I haven't forgotten about you. It's just, I don't navigate political waters so well. I tend to be a bull in a china shop, so it takes me a little longer to get things done sometimes when they're big. SEF Developer Summit. We got another one coming up. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but look for the call to blueprints to open within the next week or so. The Firefly Giant kind of release timetable got pushed out because Firefly was so big. There was so much stuff that had to get reviewed that our timetables have gotten a little sloppy, but we're going to tighten that back up. The next CDS is going to be all about kind of the next iteration, the next giant release, and moving beyond that. Because we've got a lot of blueprints that were put together for Giant, and then there was the interim Giant Hammer release, and so this one is going to be looking specifically at Hammer and collecting all of the stuff that got left out or didn't make it into Giant, and then moving forward. So if you have any development ideas, desires for what's going to go into Hammer, this is where you need to express them and discuss them. For those of you that aren't familiar with our SEF Developer Summit, they're 100% online. So we run them. They used to be Google Hangouts. Now it's a tool called BlueJeans. It's an open source tool. It's video conferencing, and basically it's set up so that everybody gets a chance at Sage. So if you have a feature or a bug fix or some, you know, sizable chunk of work that's going to go into the next release, we ask you to write a blueprint. Blueprints it's a form type of setup on our wiki. You just go in, you say, you know, I want to add whiz-bang feature A. You give me a couple of sentences about what it is, who owns it, ostensibly it would be you, and then maybe a couple of work items. It's really lightweight. It's not meant to be an onerous process. It's basically everybody who actually takes the time to fill out a blueprint gets a 30-minute session with Sage to discuss their upcoming work, and he can give them feedback on, okay, here's how you should do it, or keep in mind you're going to have to think about this other stuff that's in, or I just committed, you know, 3,000 lines this morning, as sages want to do, and he'll be able to give you an idea of what kinds of things you'll run against. But yeah, the call for blueprints will be opening soon. So if you have any development work that's going into Ceph, keep an eye out for that on social media, and the Ceph blog is where it'll hit. All right, so the development stuff. Giant, as I think has been mentioned a couple of times, the tree is frozen as of 9 September. So we're in feature freeze now and squashing bugs and having large fights in conference rooms and things like that as we work towards the release of Giant. .85, which was released within the last couple of weeks, includes some pretty cool stuff that's going to be kind of the banner features for Giant. Chief among those is some of the support groundwork for the RDMA stuff. If you've been following it, great. If you haven't been following it, I'm not the guy to explain it to you. Let me know and I can tell you who to talk to. We've had some great improvements coming in for the SSD stuff. We've seen a lot of independent contributions in terms of tuning and bug fixing and things like that. Not just kind of selfishly driven feature development. So it's been really nice to see our community kind of take a cut off the top as well. Additionally, we've also seen some improvements to the CivicWeb based front end for the Rados Gateway, which is really exciting to me because every time I wanted to play with the object stuff, I had to stand up, Apache and go through all of the machinations that it took to get the CGI stuff going, and that was way too much overhead. But now that we have this CivicWeb stuff, I'm pretty excited to see how that works. And one other thing that was kind of small, but I felt like it was worth mentioning, is the developers, Sage and some of our other core developers, are really starting to take some time and gather user feedback from the lists and people they talk to about kind of how to admin a cluster and how to make that better. Some of that's going to come with the GUI stuff, but as the GUI stuff grows and becomes easier, they want to make sure that the CLI kind of keeps pace. And so there's some new things like being able to show what your OSD is blocked by type things. We're also looking at a few other things that are, what was the other one I wanted to mention? Now that I'm under the lights. What's that?
Auditing.
Yeah, some of the auditing and metrics and stuff like that. Just being able to pull out information from your cluster, manage day-to-day things, as well as making things like preparing for DR and those kinds of things. Those are all getting a lot better. So keep the feedback coming. They're definitely listening and spending a lot more time thinking about how to make life better for your admins. And so the next one, the .86 release, is probably going to be more or less a Giant release candidate, and then we'll continue squashing bugs right up until Giant flies out the door. A few things I'll call out for each of the individual modules itself. RBD with Giant is going to have client-side caching turned on by default. This was something that we've been looking at for a long time. There were some I won't get into the whole stack of decisions, but originally it was decided that we didn't want to do that. But now that we're kind of maturing a little bit more, and a lot of our participation from folks is from the OpenStack world, and they really want this client-side caching stuff, and a lot of people don't remember to turn it on. In fact, that was kind of the crux of the whole thing when there were some performance benchmarks that came out a while ago, a little grenade that was thrown over the wall from our friends in Gluster, and kind of the whole crux of the argument was the fact that they didn't turn on client-side caching, and it was it was just a bad setup. So now some of those performance tuning things, we're starting to see more how people deploy, how people use Ceph in real-world environments, and so the defaults are getting tweaked and tuned a little bit, as well as providing new ways for you to tweak and tune on your own. The other thing I'd mention about RBD is RBD was in the news. The Eucalyptus stuff, so now you can do block storage with Eucalyptus backed by Ceph. There was a guy who wrote up a great blog entry on it. I just thought it was interesting to call out because of the acquisition of the Eucalyptus stuff, so always fun to see it in the news. RGW, as I mentioned, the CivicWeb front-end stuff is very exciting for us. We're also looking at some of the bucket limitations and trying to decide kind of, because we can do both Amazon S3 and OpenStack Swift natively into the Rados Gateway, sometimes there's decisions that will affect one or the other. So there's a lot of thought that's going into right now, kind of how best to handle those use cases, especially as it relates to the bucket limits and things like that. CephFS, all right, this is the most exciting part about all of this. The acquisition hand waving, the biggest excitement for me, and I'd imagine for Sage too, is the fact that a fair amount of resources are being brought to bear on CephFS by us now. If any of you know about the history of Ceph, you know that this is where it started. The Trilabs grant was to build a better luster And in doing so, kind of the focus of Sage at the beginning, before he kind of took over the whole thing, was to build a horizontally scalable metadata server. That was his whole deal. And so this is very near and dear to his heart. Having CephFS not be, or be the only part of the platform that's not, production ready or supported or whatever, I think was making him, it was burning him up inside a little bit. And so it's nice to get back to the roots and get CephFS to where it needs to be. That said, I've kind of got to start backpedaling, because while we say it's not production ready, that's a support claim more than anything else, because there are a lot of people that are using CephFS in production and doing quite well with it. It's just a matter of what your use case is and how you're handling things like your metadata. But for those of you that are involved, you'll know that the core team of Ceph developers is about 9 guys. There's a bunch of other stuff that goes on, the calamari and the deployment and orchestration stuff, and there's a lot of other stuff that goes on around it, but it's about 9 guys in our core team, and 3 of them now are assigned to CephFS full-time, so it's pretty exciting for us to see CephFS actually start making some progress, in addition to the heroic and Herculean efforts that have come in from the community, including I think there's 17 guys in China now that are working on CephFS full-time. So it's nice that we can start to match the effort from outside. And even more than that, we've started to kind of dog food CephFS. So it's to the point now where we, on all of our QA infrastructure internally, we actually use CephFS. And that's kind of helped us to sand off some of the rough edges that were immediately apparent. So feedback is always encouraged, especially on CephFS. It's come a long way in a very short amount of time since we've kind of devoted these resources to it. So if you want to spin it up and take another spin through the garden, I know Sage would welcome any feedback that comes in on the lists. Deployment orchestration. I know Sebastian spent a fair amount of his time going through some of the Ansible stuff, so I won't belabor this point too much. There are a lot of options. Ceph has flavors for all of your major orchestration and deployment frameworks. And I often get a question of which one should I use, which is why I threw this in there. Ceph Deploy itself is a great tool if you have nothing else that you need to deploy except a Ceph cluster. If you're running any sort of production or pre-production setup, though, you probably have a lot of other things, and you're going to be deploying them in some way that isn't by hand, assuming you're not a maniac. Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Salt, Juju, all viable options. Crowbar I left out, which Pete mentioned. But we have available recipes for all of them. The 2 most mature, I would say, are probably Chef and Puppet. And obviously those are the 2 most mature in terms of solutions. Now, if you like the raggedy Wild West edge, you probably are more happy with things like Ansible and Salt. It's interesting to note that Ceph Deploy is actually largely based on and utilizes stuff from Ansible. So I know Alfredo's a big fan of Ansible. Each has their own pros and cons, but definitely, if you're spinning up a Ceph cluster and you have thoughts of moving towards production, anything else, I would start using the orchestration and deployment stuff, because it's well worth using. And we talked about the release communications. Definitely going to get that going better. That's pretty much all I had for my stuff. Did we have any questions?